Well, hey, Gundam Maniacs, welcome to another episode of Gundam Explained. In this episode, we're going to dive a little deeper into GBO2 and kind of explain some of the systems, some of like the little hidden tricks that you can like make use of in GBO2 that's not necessarily spelled out for you. Luckily today I have a pro. He's been helping me out. We've got USSTalos. How you doing, man?
Good day, everyone. I'm doing pretty well. How about you, Adam?
No, doing good, doing good. This is sparked because, you've really helped me and others in the server, like, kind of understand these little hidden tricks within GBO2. The PC release is around the corner. I think this is a perfect time to not only talk about, these little, the nuances that GBO2 has, which is surprising for this game. It just shows the depth this game has, but also to kind of help make it appeal to newer players as well. It might seem scary, it might seem daunting, but maybe this video can kind of help you get a leg up in the game. So, anything you'd like to add to that?
GBO2 has a very much a depth in game. Pretty much people call it very often the souls of Gundam games.
Yeah.
The souls like a Gundam experience, I guess you could say. And very much so, the PvP experience does feel very often like that. It feels daunting for new players. And for that sole reason alone, we're going to talk into the details. Now, obviously, when you're playing, sometimes those differences do not need to leave pretty much so much rent free in your mind, but rather it's something that you sometimes need to know to move forward and feel like you can survive in the game a lot better than you would starting out.
Yeah, it's funny because among these tips, like you said, it might be that you're not going to remember them all the time. I think, at the end of the day, something that helps me as a casual yet serious player is I will pick a couple mobile suits and then truly understand what they're capable of and keep that in mind. So, yeah, let's get started. I'm going to start reading these off. You're going to help me expand on them. The first one is the rock, paper, scissors system in GBO2. So raid has advantage over support. Support has advantage over general. General has advantage over raid. That might be a simple way to put it, but anything you'd expand on there?
Pretty much the advanced and disadvantaged system that GBO2 has, the rock, paper, scissors system, is a very straightforward system. Pretty much a raid does 30% more damage against support, but a support that has a disadvantage against the raid will do 20% less damage. So overall, it tells you what your role is, what you want to go after. Of course, that doesn't mean that a raid should never fight a general or a general should never fight a support. It's based on what the battle dictates, but sometimes it's what is preferable to happen. A raid will clear out the support a lot faster, and the general will clear out a raid a lot faster.
Yeah.
So it's pretty much dictating you what you should focus on, but it's not a necessity of what you should focus on.
Yeah, no, that's a good point because as a newer player, it might be where focus, okay, if you're support, just kind of stay out of the front lines, kind of stay back, make use of all the weapons you have. As raid, yeah, maybe try to move to the front lines, see if you can take out the support. But as you kind of get more involved into the game mechanics, you can see where some support or some raid may have certain skills that could be conducive to other tactics. But again, that's something you might learn over time.
Exactly.
All right. So this second one is what cost and stars dictate about a mobile suit. So for me, easy with the cost because cost is almost like the category range in which these mobile suits can fight with each other because they somewhat kind of keep it in canon with Universal Century as, oh, you would typically see these suits battle with each other because a Toad Strider is going to take out a Zaku 1 like nothing. So usually they're not going to be battling with each other. But can you expand on the stars a bit?
The stars or the rarity system of the GBO2 usually dictates a lot more than just pretty much, oh, it's so difficult to acquire this mobile suit. It usually also dictates how many skills it will have. A 4-star mobile suit will have sometimes even double the skill list that the 2-star would have.
Okay.
So stars also dictate a lot more than just the rarity, but also it very often dictates the performance of the mobile suit. That doesn't mean necessarily that you should be only using 4 stars. Sometimes people are a lot more comfortable with 1 and 2 stars than they are with 4 stars. You should always focus on the mobile suit that is fitting in your playstyle.
Yeah, that's a good point because there are times where I like suits that have a lot of variety. because then I can on the battlefield kind of change what I want to do. But there's some suits, and I'd say the GPO-1 is one of these where it's just a simple setup, and you just make use of that simple setup. So I think that's a good point.
The 4-star soul, though, as I was going to say, dictates also an extra bit of the skill list. Now, again, the GPO-1, as you put it yourself, feels very straightforward, but it is still a 3-star. It has still a very large variety of skills that it can use, although many probably don't use very often. Like, for an example, as you were talking about with me and yesterday with the guys, where pretty much a jump attack could pretty much change the whole game, if you remember.
That's right.
And the GPO-1 has a flight control program that almost nobody uses, where it allows you to even dash in the air.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's not necessarily the simple weapon setup, but it's skills that are there for the player to read, but it's not like thrown in your face, especially for new players, to be like, oh, I can do this and this. And yeah, so that's a good idea to check the skills, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Anything else you wanted to talk on that before I move on?
Not necessarily. The cost, you actually covered it very nicely yourself. Although I should say that the cost also is dictated by the level of the mobile suits. And sometimes a level 4 mobile suit can be a 700 cost, but you always need to remember that in the 700 room, it will probably drop to 2 stars because its rarity and its stars dictate that in that cost, it's not going to perform as well as you'd think that it would in its, let's just say, base cost. A GPO-1 at level 4 at 700 cost is a 2-star versus in level 1 where it's a 3-star because it has to compete with the much stronger mobile suits.
Wow. Yeah, see, that's that's where it can, on the surface, seem a little complicated. So that's interesting stuff. Okay. So about skills. So number 3, your mobile suit skill list dictates what it can do with and without its gimmicks. Read closely what each skill says. Now, this is something that you've helped really drill into me that I never, as a newer player, not even a newer, but I've been playing since the beginning, but as a casual yet serious player, that was one element of the game that was missing from me in order to really level up my game. And that was looking at the skills, seeing what unique skills exist that I can take advantage of in a situation. You were talking about the flight control program. That's so that I can be in the air and kind of maneuver. Yesterday, I was trying to shoot you in air, and you literally, while you were in air, like nearly strafed I think it was a beam blast coming at you. But there's other skills that I've learned, like, maneuver armor, where if you're boosting, someone could shoot you and it won't stun you. Yeah, can you expand on that?
You are exactly correct. And pretty much even then, even if we talk, let's say, maneuver armor is very generic because there is multiple levels of maneuver armor. A level 1 maneuver armor, as you put yourself, when you're dashing, you will not stagger by conventional weapons. You need to be suppressed, or you need to be pretty much hit with a heavy stagger, which we will talk with later, or about, should I say. But there are different levels of maneuver armor. Level 1 maneuver armor is just that generic skill. Level 2 maneuver armor diminishes how much stagger value you take. So let's say even a suppressive weapon will take a lot more shots to stagger you, and you take reduced damage. Level 3 maneuver armor also adds the effect that if your shield breaks while you're dashing, you will not stagger from your shield break. Again, just at the least, even if you see maneuver armor, that doesn't mean that you've read it all if you do not sit down and read it regardless.
Okay, yeah. So let me ask you then, and this is something that I'm not sure of. So some mobile suits have a skill that can be used with on the PS5 or PlayStation. It's called the touchpad. It's probably another button when it comes to PC. Is that a skill?
That is a skill.
Okay.
Active Guard, Exam, Hades, NTD for the unicorn types, all of those are an activated ability, as it's called. It's usually a timed ability, which in different mobile suits acts differently, but that's what it is. It's a skill which you need to activate. Even the transformation of mobile suits, because we have Zeta units, it's still a touchpad skill. And if you go in your skill list, it will say transform as a skill.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. So I guess out of all skills, those are probably the most used because it is in front of the player's face as something that they can activate. Yeah. Okay, cool. So, moving on. Number 4, crouching, zooming in, and going prone increase your defense and offense. So, So yeah, in GBO you can crouch and go prone. What's cool about doing it as a mech is it is slow, so it's almost like you want to make sure you're using it at the right time, knowing where your enemies or even allies are on the map. Because I'll sometimes get stuck into something where I want to, and this happened yesterday with you, where I was getting out of a crouch, but it was just too slow for me to get away from you. Can you kind of explain the best scenarios for that?
Honestly, crouching and scoping in, proning, all of that usually is done for sniper units or units with a heavy weapon that can do a lot of damage. Because when you crouch, you increase your damage by 5%, your damage resistance is by 1%. Scoping in is another 5%. And going prone, instead of the 5% of crouching and the 1% damage resistance, you get a 10% damage increase, 1% damage resistance, and a plus 2% to ballistic resistances. Very specific, I know. All of these can be used in many ways. First of all, the crouching and zooming in or going prone works really well with snipers. You make your body a lot smaller to the enemy, and with zooming in, obviously, you're gonna make your accuracy go up because you know where you're shooting.
Yeah.
Now, on top of that, the proning, pretty much something that most people don't know is that it can resist staggers unless you get back swung or down swung, if you prefer, by a melee weapon, which knocks you down and topples you regardless.
Yeah. Okay, so you're saying that you could be shot with something that would typically stagger, but if you're prone, you won't get that effect. So you can then be like, oh, I need to get up and get out of here.
You can get up and get out of there, or if you feel comfortable enough, even exchange shots.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. That's a cooler way to go about it, actually. Yeah.
I've
Okay.
done that very often, especially when I was running the Desert Gym with the railgun of the Desert Gym.
Oh,
People
yeah.
would usually shoot at me and they think, okay, I hit the support, but then the support hits back with a heavier weapon, and they're like, that's not a good idea.
Yeah, that's a good one. You've always talked about that Desert GM, and yeah, that's a good one. Okay. So 5, a lot of mobile suits have gimmicks which are unique to themselves. Find the advantages and disadvantages of their gimmicks. So yeah, I think the gimmicks is interesting because there are some suits that have some very unique gimmicks to them. There was one yesterday, in fact, I think I was the Hazel 2, and I found out that while I was dashing, and I guess maybe there's a difference you can help between a skill or a gimmick, or a skill could be a gimmick, but it allowed me to do a 180 turn while I was boosting. Yeah, and I was like, wow, this is awesome. But then it made me think, okay, knowing that that's a gimmick, I would have to practice using that gimmick a lot to really make full use of it. So any way you can expand on that?
You are pretty correct on how you think about the gimmick, because usually gimmicks are described through their skill. For an example, the Alex Tobam armor with the Tobam armor skill, its gimmick is that its resistances towards ballistic weapons is enhanced by 50%, which is crazy on its own, and it cannot be stunned by conventional ballistic weapons.
Yeah.
Same with the quick turn of the Hazel 2 that you used, and especially if you combo, for an example, the Hazel 2's quick turn with the heavy attack, you can do a quick 180 behind the enemy and hit them from behind. You do have to practice what you do with that gimmick. The unicorn suits, the Banshee, the Phoenix, the unicorn itself. Maybe in the future we'll see the Banshee Norn full armor unicorn. Sorry, voice crack. Maybe if we're lucky enough, unicorn perfectability. Their gimmick is the NTD and how it changes their entire playstyle. All of that usually falls under the skill list category, but very often you'll have suits that have gimmick weapons, like the Desert Gym and the Railgun. You don't have any other unit using that weapon.
Yeah. What about, like, for instance, the Doulahan has that shield that shoots machine gun fire. Is that a unique gimmick to that suit?
That and the Gym Guard custom, they both share the unique Guardian shield. But yeah, it's still a very good gimmick, and the difference between the two is that the Gym Guard custom can stay a lot more at range, whereas the Doulahan, for an example, its gimmick, although it's the same, it still pretty much encourages you to stay close with its melee weapon. Their gimmicks are very much similar, but the playstyle still changes based on the suit.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, because with the Doulahan, I think the one reason I do like it is when I am moving in, engaging into a group of enemies, sometimes I'll make that wrong split-second decision, but with the Doulahan, I can pull out that shield, kind of get some hits on it before I get close enough to use it. Was it a lance, or what is the name of that type of...
Yeah,
a lance?
Heat lance.
Yeah, heat lance, yeah. All right, well, yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, so I would suggest once you get into a suit... kind of figure out what its gimmick is and then practice utilizing the gimmick, because I think at the end of the day, you're going to be more successful with a suit that's meant to use a gimmick. So, all right. Okay, so number 6, the benefits of aquatic suits underwater, space units in space, ground units on ground, and the disadvantages of not being in their main locale. And I've learned from, I think it's the Aqua GM, which I loved, like when they started releasing those water maps and then you could be underwater with the Aqua GM, I realized, wow, like it really is fun to play. It's made for that. Likewise with space, there's a lot where it's really about the thrust, the maneuverability, and when you're in space, just take advantage of that versus a unit that would have both ground and space. But yeah, expand on that if you can.
Pretty much to explain, locales give unique buffs to mobile suits. For an example, a ground combat team will gain a 5% less thruster consumption, increase in movement speed, turning speed, and even recovery from overheat time while on ground. But obviously underwater, it loses a lot of those buffs and becomes a lot slower because it's not meant for the locale. Something else also that the non-aquatic units also lose out is that they lose 50% of their radar range because they are not equipped for underwater combat. So let's just say a unit that has 300 radar range suddenly drops to 150, which is your Vulcan range.
Yeah.
Suddenly you have the enemy in front of you by the time that you actually know that they're there. And in space, although most suits that can go to space are very much gaining benefits because it's a lot easier to move, space-specific units gain an astounding 25% movement speed and 30%, 35%, I think, reduction in cost in thruster cost. So even then, if simple things that might not appear like much become nuts. So you want to use local specific. That doesn't mean that you're discouraged from using other units, but local specific units. Let's just say that there are units that go on the ground stay on ground. Units that are specialized in space go in space, and the water specialized suits that want to stay in the water. You can still use obviously the Gundam marine type or the Aqua Dream in on ground, but you will gain more benefits going underwater, especially with the skills like the aquatic mobile shooting, which allows you to shoot your primary weapon while you're underwater while dashing.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting, and I think something I get out of this too is you bring up percentages, which I think the different areas that a suit could be in, I think is the biggest factor when thinking of percentage differences. But I think for those listening, from what we've gone through so far, there is a degree of understanding a percentage difference of what a skill or weapon or buff might do. That is a daunting part of this because I wasn't a math whiz back in school. In fact, I've pretty much ignored math anywhere I can, but I see where it's beneficial here, where it is kind of good to kind of take the time and know, oh, I am going to obviously have this percentage increase. That can help you dictate what your next move is going to be. It really can, because if you knew you would have a percentage decrease doing something, you would know then, oh, I need to back off and not engage or whatever. So yeah, no, that's a good one. So 7 stagger variations and what dictates them. So yeah, I think a big part of GBO2, part of that rock, paper, scissors is the stagger element too, because a lot of weapons have different ways of suppressing, of staggering, and you want to use that to your advantage, especially if you want to be able to stagger the enemy, learn to switch to your next weapon to follow up, do some more attacks. But then there's different types of staggers on top of that too. And just like we were talking about a second ago, you want to memorize sometimes the time that it will take to recover, or that it's going to take an enemy to recover. And if you can expand on that.
There are 5 stagger variations technically. The one is that is no stagger, which is the usual machine guns, right? Your average machine gun, the 100mm machine gun for the Federation, the Zaku machine gun for Xeon, for an example, they don't create any stagger or flints. The flints is the next step. Flints is usually done by beam guns, like the beam spray gun that the gym has. That's when pretty much we start actually mattering with our stagger variations. A flint, which you already know, for an example, will stop you from, let's say, rolling out of an attack. It will flinch and will make you actually try to dash instead if you try to roll. Very often I've heard people who get frustrated, why can't I roll? If you've been flinched by an attack, you cannot roll. You cannot even at times shoot heavier weapons. You can only shoot the lower stagger variant weapon. So let's say if you get flinched on your shoulder when you're trying to shoot your beam rifle, which staggers normally, your beam rifle will not fire, and people get often frustrated by it. The next step is a stagger, which is the classic you get hit by a bazooka or a beam rifle, where you take a step back and you're stuck there for a moment. That's the most common stagger that people use very often. Now, there are obviously suits that are immune to those staggers as well, which we'll talk about later. Then there is the heavy stagger. The example is the Desert Gym from before, and the Magella Top Cannon of the Zac 1 Sniper, where if you get hit by that, you get dropped on one knee. You're stuck there until you get back up, and that can lock people down badly. And finally, there is the last stagger variation, which is toppling. If you get hit by a downswing from a melee weapon, a heavy attack, or even a counter, you're stuck on the ground until your mobile suit gets back up.
Yeah, so that again, that's I think another element that you got to kind of memorize, because a lot of this is the timing, is figuring out, okay, when am I going to follow up based on either stagger animation? It could be me. It could be I've staggered and then I'm going to plan to dodge out of the way as soon as I get out of that, hopefully, you know. So yeah, no, that's a big one. And knowing that there's so many variations to that too, like you mentioned, is something to keep in mind. Okay, so this next one, number 8, instant stun and suppressive weapons and their benefits. So I'll just let you go with this one. I think you'll explain this well.
Instant stun weapons are pretty much like we were talking about, the bazookas, beam rifles, heavy stagger weapons, or even melee weapons. Those weapons obviously very easily set up enemies for you or your team to follow it up in combos, to continue chaining your attacks, to keep locking them in place, locking them down, as we often call it in GBO2. The problem is that there are mobile suits that are often immune to instant stuns. May it be with shock dampeners, may that be explosive reactive armor, maneuver armor, all of that makes them immune towards instant stuns. But instead, that's why you have your suppressive weapons. Let's
Yeah.
just say fully automatic machine guns, beam spray guns that fast fire. All of that is to counter skills that are there to stop a mobile suit from stunning. So you want to be able to figure out if you want to use either or based on the situation. If you see an enemy mobile suit is not stunning, let's just say a GOG. A GOG is walking towards you with its massive frame, and you can't stop it. What do you do? You have to switch to a machine gun and try to stop it that way. Otherwise, it's not stopping because it's build-up stun. That's what we call it. Now, obviously, there are skills to stop suppressive weapons as well, like damage
Yeah.
control. But again, it's knowing your enemy and seeing what works best.
And I think what I've learned from you, correct me if I'm wrong, is to really use Vulcans whenever you can, because they really add to that suppression over time, correct?
You are correct. And very often there are Vulcans that are better at suppressing than most machine guns. Like, for an example, the GP1's Vulcans are better at suppressing enemies than its bullpup machine gun that you can equip as a primary, which
Wow.
is very wise usually to have the instant beam rifle for the GP1 and the Vulcan so that you can have two types of stun available.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. See, and again, I would, for those of you that are newer to the game, I think this is the perfect time to take out a spreadsheet. Just type in your favorite mobile suits you want to use, and then track down its skills. Kind of like what you brought up, the idea of using the instant stun beam rifle with the Vulcans. I think that's the way you can make best use of the suit. I know I can't memorize all this stuff. I do have a spreadsheet for myself as well. All right. Yeah. So number 9, flight units operate like you are in space, but use fuel to do so. Learning how to fight in space allows you to fight on the ground with them. So this is a big one too, because I love playing in space. Again, the reason I play GBO2 is because I love it, how it feels. It feels like I'm playing a Gundam game. Space to me is pivotal in Gundam. I love space combat. Though it seems in the community, especially among hardcore players, they'd rather not play in space. They'd rather just, play other, like on ground. And but it's fun to play in space, but it's almost completely different because you have a full 3D space that you have to keep in mind. You've been teaching me a lot about how to really make use of boosting in space. If you want to expand on that.
You're correct, because especially in space, you get skills like high spec comeback, which the high spec comeback allows you to move a lot more fluently fluidly. I can't English, forgive me. It's a lot more of a fluidic movement. You move like you move in a river, I guess you could say, because you do not stop moving. In space, you stop moving, you're an easy target. Just like on ground, but on ground, it's a lot easier to predict where someone goes. You go left, right, back, and forth. Sometimes someone will do the occasional smart jump to avoid some strikes. In space, you don't have that. You have to predict where the person moves. And that's why, for an example, flight units are very effective on ground as well, because people suddenly go from thinking, oh, people are moving in one specific pattern, Y and Z axis, right? Or a Y and X, depending on where you are.
Yeah.
People suddenly go horizontally, they go vertically, down, up, left, right, forward, back. It doesn't matter. You have to think where the enemy is going to move. It's 3D movement, exactly as you put it. That suddenly becomes a challenge for most enemies on the battlefield, and it gives you the advantage on both the ground and space if you're especially using flight unit. Which, as you put it, many people choose to avoid space and in turn avoid flight unit as well.
Yeah, no, and just to add to that, I remember when we were playing one time, you were pointing out, I think it was one of the Hazel supports I was using, where it has a shield booster, and that has an extra element too when you're in space, especially if you then lose the shield booster, which, yeah, that's just a neat, again, another thing to memorize. So, okay, so number 10, standing still while not attacking makes you invisible on the radar. And I think that's kind of a, that's not something I was even thinking about, but that's like an old school FPS thing. I want to say like Halo maybe was one that did something like that. Yeah.
You're correct. And it's a very simple and straightforward tip. If you stand still, you become invisible on the radar. People, if they don't know that they're there, you can be ignored and they will walk right by you. Very often, it's great for ambushes, stay hidden and try to repair. Just make sure that they don't have their attention on you, because even if you disappear, they'll know that you were there.
That's a good one. I haven't really been thinking about that, because there are times where you get into this, like, I don't know what to call it, a fidget battle, where it's like two units are like across from each other and they're like strafing back and forth, constantly moving. And I think sometimes that's needed to avoid fire, but also if you can back yourself out, maybe get yourself in a good corner, just stop, because that could confuse the enemy, because especially if you're playing correctly, you are looking at your radar. And then if you're not seeing the enemy, you just assume, okay, I guess they're not here anymore. So, all right, going to 11, starting a high-speed movement early can be interrupted with a dodge roll if you input it fast enough. This is a cool one you showed me, and I was able to pull it off, if you want to expand on that.
Oh, it's a very simple technique. We pretty much call it the zigzag, honestly. It's a very simple move. Instead of just force injecting, because some suits lack force injectors, by just dashing it one direction and changing your direction really quickly with a dodge roll, cancels out very early the animation of the dash into a roll. That can throw people off and very quickly make them actually miss their shots. Dodge roll does give you iframes, but at the start of the iframes, you still are vulnerable. If you can manage to entirely avoid the damage by just zigzagging into the dodge roll, it very often can save your bacon.
Yeah, I feel like that's another move to kind of practice doing over time to get that muscle memory, because I mean, a lot of in GBO2, especially when I was talking about the kind of fidget action that happens between two mobile suits, that's the perfect opportunity to really make the enemy think you're going one way. And yeah, hightail it the other way, get an attack out of them to kind of end that stalemate that sort of happens sometimes, Yeah, I like that one. Also, I love it because it just further emphasizes the skill-based combat that this game has. Deliberate, skill-based in terms of your movement, actually, and not just a turn-based game or not just numbers, All right, so 12, if your radar is jammed, that usually means a unit that has stealth is nearby. Keep your eyes peeled and use your ears as well. Mobile suits are loud. Yeah, because that is a good indicator to where you need to kind of change your tactic all of a sudden. Because then you could be doing one thing looking at your radar, and then if that pops up, it's like, okay, I was engaging with someone, but maybe they have a buddy around the corner, like a Black Rider, right?
That would be correct, yes. Black Rider sadly though doesn't have the stealth skill itself. The reason we use usually the radar is jump. The jumping usually goes
Oh, yeah.
together in most stealth units with stealth as well. But very often when your radar gets jumped, that means that there might be like an Efrit Nacht around because it both jumps your radar and has stealth. Now, obviously, you want to have your ears peeled because you will hear very often footsteps of mobile suits that have purely stealth only, like the Pixie, but it will not give it away with jamming. Jamming just is a very easy way to tell if there's a unit around that causes both jamming and has stealth. Because very rarely you'll see units that have only jamming, like the Black Rider, as you mentioned. The Black Rider, though, has the optical camouflage, which makes up for the lack of stealth.
Right. Yeah. No, and that's a cool one, especially seeing when you were showing like what you can look for if there's stealth, to kind of get an idea of like where they could be, seeing the smoke trail or seeing the little mist of, you know, whatever that stealth technology is being used. Okay. 13, counter animations knock enemies down for a variety of time. Know when to capitalize on your knockdown and when to use it to back off retreat. Yeah, can you expand on that?
Knockdowns or counters in GBO2 have a very unique timer. There are counters that knock people down for almost 10 seconds, and there are counters that knock people down for a few 2 to 3, maybe 4 seconds. Those usual counters, like the pickup of the Gundam and then ground slam, that counter is there to be able to get maybe a hit in and back off as quickly as possible. But the support would not want to capitalize and stay, you know, for that counter there. Because a support will not be able to get as much done with its counter rather than it would by backing off and running away in that case. But there are also raids like the Hyakushiki where it has a high kick counter which knocks people down for a good 8 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
That 8 seconds can give you a good time to get in a forward and a full back swing to do it an insane amount of damage on top of the counter on the enemy that pretty much try to fight you. It's trying to know which counter animations knock down people for a long time and which counter animations drop them down for a short amount of time that you should capitalize on. For an example, the GPO4, because it has a high kick counter, although it's a support, you can back off while firing constantly at the grounded enemy. But again, it's knowing when to pick your moment to either run away, stay here, you know, run to your teammates because they probably haven't noticed that there's an enemy there if it's a stealth unit. All of that pretty much plays in the game on just a simple counter.
Yeah.
Very often a counter can save you or kill you.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's just another thing that's important to memorize and keep in mind. And based on a mobile suit, like you're talking about the Hyakushiki, that could be its gimmick in a way, where part of its gimmick is how it uses the counter. All right, so 14, melee attacks can be delayed and canceled in some cases with some suits.
This is a pretty straightforward tip, but the melee attacks, especially with units that have multi-strikes, can be delayed. Let's say you fire a neutral swing and then you wait for a split second, and before the animation finishes of your recovery, you do a down swing. That can catch people off guard because they'll think, oh, he's out of fuel. That's why he's not moving. And they try to get in to hit you. And suddenly you just hit them with a downswing. And that out of nowhere is just a surprise attack. It will throw people off and out of their game. And on top of that, the cancelled melee attacks, for an example, the Efrit TS, it's downswing as you start up. If you does early on, you can very often cancel it. Same with the Pixie and the Black Rider. Those melee attacks can be cancelled so that you can keep yourself safe in the process of attacking.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think the suits you brought up are raids, and raids are usually on the front line doing melee, so having that kind of extra control over your melee is actually important for something like a raid. Anyway.
And exactly, and another suit, for an example, that also has those exact same things is the Galgo ground type VD and the Daija SER, the Zero Siki. Melee-oriented units, it may be raid general, or in some cases even a support, based on which support it is, like the GPO4. Its downswing, its long lance has a very small window, but you can still dash out very quickly.
Okay. Yeah, that's good stuff to know. Again, when picking your suit, keep that stuff in mind, how the melee works. I think there was a suit I was using yesterday, I forget which one, where I was like, hey, I'm not comboing. And it's like, well, that suit doesn't do that. You know, it was like, oh, yeah, I should have remembered, you know. It's easy to forget that stuff. All right, so 15, the advantages and disadvantages of multi-stacking the same MS in teams. Can you expand on that?
There are many people that use the same suit in multiple categories. Let's just say in 600 recently, you'll see many people use a lot of times the Atlas because it can do a little bit of everything. The problem is that because of that, you lack variety in your team composition. On top of that, if you use same class mobile suits, not necessarily same mobile suits themselves, but same class mobile suits, if you multi-stack, let's just say if you have 3 generals and the enemy team has only 1 raid, your general will lose 5% of its damage towards that raid, either you believe it or not, because the game is trying to balance out that that player also needs to play the game rather than have 3 generals instantly gank up on the said raid and just decimate. So
Interesting.
multi-stacking, not only the same class, but also the same mobile suit, you lose variety very quickly, and very often you lose the strategic advantage of playing in a team. Suddenly you just become playing you, just squared.
Well, yeah, that is very interesting. I never thought about that. That's another good tip there. Yeah, I guess, and two, that could be when you're talking with your teammates of what suit people are going to use, keeping that stuff in mind. I guess that actually goes again with that whole team-based aspect this game has, really.
This game does not focus on you. You're not the protagonist. It's a multiplayer game, and you want to work with your team.
Yeah.
Imagine like being ground suits fighting against ground suits. You're not the Gundam protagonist, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, that's a really good way to put it. Well, yeah, so look, all these tips are awesome. I'm sure there's so many more, but I think I have become a better player because some of these you've helped, bring up to my attention. Again, I think when it comes to the math, that's where I'm a little slow, but I am slowly getting there by really checking my mobile suit skills. It could be I love a suit, but based on its skills, I'm not going to have that much fun with it. Or I might find out a suit that I've always wanted to use that seems scary. Look at its skills, so then just start using that. Use the training or get with some buddies to train to just repeatedly use skills, repeatedly use some of these tips. So Talos, thank you very much. You have a YouTube channel. I'll have it linked below. You do post your videos, which are really good to watch to get an idea of maybe how to best use a suit. Also, you hang out at the Gundam Explained Discord all the time, giving people tips. So really, if anyone has a question, jump in there, throw your question into the GBO2 chat. I am sure Talos would probably respond to it eventually. But where else could people find you if they needed to?
That's pretty much everywhere that they can find me. I'm not really active anywhere else as often as I would like to. Life is a is a doozy.
Yeah, especially all the time it takes
to be active.
No, especially all the time and effort it takes to understand GBO2. How do you have time for anything else? That's what I ask myself. But
it's called not sleeping.
Oh yeah,
Don't
there
do
you
that,
go.
people.
Well, cool, everyone. Yeah, thanks for watching. We'll talk later.
Have a good day.